arrived in North Dakota in the dead of winter. Few saw it coming, but slowly signs began to appear of a global catastrophe that we would never forget. As the news got steadily worse, we worried that nothing would ever be the same. It touched everything: business, education, agriculture, energy production, transportation, tourism, politics, religion, healthcare, food distribution, and our relationships. How we talked with each other, all would be radically transformed.
The year 2020 is a year that anyone of any age will remember, because it'll be the year of the global pandemic.
Hello, I'm Monica Hannon.
And I'm Jody Kurzman.
This is a one-hour look back on COVID-19, the virus that changed everything.
For many, life will never be the same. Today, March 27th, marks 1 year since the coronavirus claimed the first life in North Dakota. Since that time, nearly 1,500 people have died. More than 102,000 people in the state have tested positive for the virus. Some are still battling.
Well, this is the story of a year that blindsided us, but also showed how people from all walks of life adapted, confronted, grieved, and found a way forward.
Today, the World Health Organization officially announced that this is a global pandemic.
March 11th, 2020, President Donald Trump addresses the American people as the first case of coronavirus is confirmed in North Dakota.
But weeks before the official announcement of a pandemic, there were ominous warnings as the world celebrated Christmas 2019. We began there. Hope Sisk gives us a look at the timeline for COVID in the year 2020.
The year 2020 started off with reports of a mysterious and concerning new virus emerging from China.
In the first few weeks of the year, we were watching infections begin to make their way into the United States. And 1 year ago today, a Ward County man in his 60s tested positive for what we'd soon come to know as COVID-19.
Broadcasting live, the Night Report at 10 starts right now.
Some breaking news: North Dakota now has its first confirmed case of coronavirus.
That day set off a massive statewide response as health officials merged to create a task force, learned to trace COVID-19 contacts throughout the community, and set up mass testing sites, all as Governor Doug Burgum began daily briefings to keep the public informed on efforts to contain this virus that threatened to overwhelm our healthcare system and put our loved ones and ourselves at risk. Our lives changed.
None of us enjoy change. We're humans. We like it the way it was yesterday, as opposed to desiring it to be a lot different tomorrow for the most part. But this has been a lot of change that's been forced on us. It's going to be a period of discomfort. But I know that if any state is going to come through it, it's going to be North Dakota.
We learned what it would mean to keep a 6-foot distance from our loved ones and coworkers.
Well, not only is this happening here in the studio, but also throughout our building. Our news, weather, and sports teams have been spread out, so we're all working at least 6 feet apart.
Then on March 13th, the governor declared a state of emergency. Days later, schools were ordered to close and later to remain in an online format, meaning graduations, proms, and important tests would not be what any of us had in mind.
I haven't seen my classmates for almost 3 months, and now getting back together to see all the faces for the last time, it's crazy, and I don't know if it's hit me yet, but it will eventually.
Within a week, we were seeing food and supply shortages at grocery stores, courts closed and businesses impacted. Communities did what they could to support those businesses, especially restaurants. Neighbors did what they could to check in on each other. On March 27th, the first North Dakotan died with COVID-19.
Your sacrifice by not being together may, in fact, save the lives of your loved ones.
Over the course of the following year, more than 1,400 of our loved ones died with the disease. Yet North Dakotans tried resiliently to prove this virus could not break our spirit.
There is no limits to the amount of kindness that we can show to other people. There's no limit to the amount of gratitude we can give to other people. There's no limit to the amount of patience that we can provide to other people. And there certainly is no limit on the amount of love that we can share for people that are actually suffering.
By August, schools were making plans to return students to instruction as active cases began to spike. The holiday season would bring new concerns about the risks of gathering with loved ones. And by November 13th, North Dakota recorded its highest count of active cases the same day that Governor Doug Burgum issued a statewide mask mandate.
As daily news coverage of the pandemic dominated the headlines, the way many in North Dakota kept up with the latest was from the governor's press briefings. Governor Burgum did what most other governors did. He held daily announcements on the latest trends, orders, and mitigation efforts. And reporter Jacob Noderman was always there.
At the height of the pandemic, the governor's daily press briefings were must-watch television. The governor would take the podium and give his address and then take questions from the press, not to mention the more than 40 life-changing executive orders in the first 2 months. It all started in a small room at the Capitol.
North Dakota is officially declaring a state of emergency. We'd like to actually declare a state of calm.
From there, the governor would become a daily contributor to the airwaves. The more than hour-long specials would become the governor's platform to calm a scared population and try to persuade a skeptical one too. Some pleas even getting emotional.
If someone is wearing a mask, they're not doing it to represent what political party they're in or what candidates they support. They might be doing it because they've got a 5-year-old child who's been going through cancer treatments. They might have vulnerable adults in their life who are currently have COVID and are fighting.
While a change in behavior was sold during the press conferences, its implementation was put to local authorities. Not the police necessarily, but the task forces, which popped up in cities seeing high COVID rates.
We started moving forward in colors more so than other parts of the state. So when we went from yellow to orange, and the state followed soon after that because it became such an outbreak across the entire state.
Task forces and cities would be responsible for their own business and mask guidance and were given COVID risk meters with corresponding recommendations. While some counties qualified for mask mandates and business closures, they remained recommendations. But deciding which to implement would prove to be a difficult task.
There was that interest level of, well, you know, if we're one color and Morton County is another color, how do we function? Because we cross the river and work and live and play and do all of that in 2 different counties.
At one point, nearly all of North Dakota's counties had a rolling positive rate above 10%. Others went above 20. In the fall, the risk meter was abandoned and guidance returned to a statewide policy. From top to bottom, the response was a rally to be North Dakota smart and show gratitude for those working to save lives. And with the vaccine continuing to be rolled out and priority groups being checked off, North Dakota is in the national spotlight for good reasons.
Well, one of the results of those briefings was an almost continual discussion on wearing masks to contain the spread of the virus. At first, it was just advice, but soon, following the guidelines of the Centers for Disease Control, the mask became a mandatory accessory. And finally, there was a mask mandate. As Morgan Benth reports, who wore them and who did not became a political football.
Whether it's a cloth mask that can be washed and reworn, or a one-use surgical mask, or any other mask in between, North Dakotans have their viewpoints on wearing them.
From opinions on whether masks are effective,
there's no actual evidence that proves this,
or take away personal freedom,
it's not really taking your right away,
to business owners trying to serve their customers.
But they do complain about it, which is totally understandable.
Differing views on masks have caused clashes. Public health professionals,
people are dying alone, and we need to do something,
disagree with some state lawmakers.
But I don't think any one of them would want us to give up our freedom for their loss.
Causing conflict as we saw those in charge tiptoe around mask mandate policy. Cases started rising over the summer in July and continued with seemingly no end. Public health leaders pushed for Governor Doug Burgum to institute a statewide mask mandate.
This is the least use of masks that we have seen in retail establishments of any place we have been. And we find that deeply unfortunate.
But instead, the pressure got put on local governments, stirring up controversy at meetings across the state.
For me, it did not make sense to have a mask mandate in place in just Bismarck or just Fargo or just Grand Forks or just Minot. And I just was not going to go down that road.
The governor was adamant a mandate couldn't be enforced.
Masks work, mask mandates is inconclusive.
Nonetheless, as the state continued to climb in active cases, a statewide mask mandate, along with other COVID-19 mitigation strategies, were announced on November 13th as cases skyrocketed to over 10,000. Even so, some law enforcement across the state declined to enforce it.
In a nutshell, we will not be enforcing mandates.
But after a month of mandates in place, cases dropped by more than 7,500 and continue to drop as the governor let the mandates expire in mid-January. Active cases are still low on March 11th.
No matter how you feel about wearing a mask, this year's history shows it helped decrease COVID-19 case counts and is helping us get back to a new normal.
The pandemic left many people looking for ways to spread joy and hope in the face of distressing news that was dominating news and social media. A Facebook group called Neighbors Helping Neighbors reached out to those in need. Page creator Nicole Dykema said she wanted to help get supplies to people at risk.
Things feel very out of control right now, and doing this for my own self is helps put things in perspective and realize we can control this. We can make it through this, and it is very helpful for me personally.
The group grew to nearly 1,800 members in just 4 days. One Dickinson mom came up with a creative way for her homebound kids to brighten others' lives. Cousins Molly and Lucia Ellerkamp love using their crayons and markers.
I'm coloring all the rainbow.
This week, they're creating pictures with a purpose.
I've been coloring pictures for people at the nursing home.
Molly's mom, Amanda, says this is a perfect project.
Art's something to keep them busy during the day when they're looking for their things to do.
It's also a way for them to brighten someone else's day.
Because they might be living in fear of the coronavirus.
They've already delivered nearly 20 pictures to St. Benedict's nursing home. And they've got more ready to go.
Doing that for something good that is really fun.
We always try and teach our kids to think about other people, that life isn't just about you, and especially when things are tough. And one of the things about this crummy situation we're all in is we're all in it together. So I think anything we can do to brighten somebody else's day, it makes their day to do it. It makes somebody else's day to get that picture. And those little things are really important. And in the end, that's really what it's about, is taking care of each other.
An important lesson these girls are learning, one coloring page at a time.
Some use art to share their feelings and spread joy. Others use their voices.
For Colleen Reinhardt, that's meant singing the national anthem live on Facebook a few times every week. Since November, she's sung the Star-Spangled Banner more than 30 times and shared them all on her Facebook page. She says the national anthem has an important message that's got extra meaning right now.
It's important. It is to bring us together as a nation, and I think we ought to do that.
Coming up.
And she got isolated. All I can do is wave at her through a window.
The heavy toll the pandemic took on relationships, families, and especially the healthcare system. In the past 365 days, hundreds of healthcare workers have dedicated their lives to making people well. So it's hard to overestimate the devastation they feel when people die in large numbers, despite their best efforts. As the months passed, they quickly learned new ways of dealing with the ravages of the virus. Hospitals gathered what PPE they could, slowed elective surgeries to make time for COVID patients to recover, and they did their best to discover treatments that would slow the progress of the virus to give people time to heal. The surge hit North Dakota in mid-October. After a year of constant change, hospital directors say the pandemic has made them stronger and more prepared to deal with emergencies.
From the start, our nation has relied on the people working behind the scenes to get us to the point we're at now. Emmeline Ivey has more on the struggle and perseverance it took to get here and how we truly are all in this together.
Last year, the pandemic shocked us all and created an unexpected chain reaction. COVID patients relied on healthcare workers, the community relied on contact tracers, and now we're all relying on the Department of Health to help us get vaccines into as many people's arms as possible. It wasn't always smooth sailing, but those I spoke to say we've come a long way. At its onset, doctors and nurses snapped into action, turning their attention to COVID patients desperate for their care.
It's very difficult holding someone's hand as they are on a pressure mask because they don't want to be intubated, and they're on the same pressure mask for 2 weeks and trying to get an opportunity to eat, trying to get an opportunity to take that mask off. You need to take that pressure mask off and their oxygen would drop so far it was unsafe for them to eat.
There was no time to waste. Hospitals gathered what PPE they could, slowed elective surgeries to make time for COVID patients, and did their best to discover effective treatments for the virus.
There was shock, there was concern, and I'd say there was some misbelief that this was actually happening in the year 2020, given our medical technology across the world.
The surge hit North Dakota in mid-October.
On a daily basis, we were tracking the number of open beds we had in the state and the number of ICU beds we had in the state. And in some days, at the height of our North Dakota surge, if that's what you want to call it, we had between 2 and 5 ICU beds in the state, which if we're having this conversation 2 years ago, that would have been unheard of.
For every person that contracts COVID, a contact tracer makes a call to their loved ones who have been in close quarters.
I was working 60 hours plus. My days would go from 7:30 a.m. until 9:30 p.m. some days. I was working Saturdays and Sundays, and it was stressful. I had to make sure to take breaks myself just to eat.
Niesemeyer says when numbers peaked in North Dakota, his team members were making more than 30 calls a day. He says cases have dwindled, which has allowed his team to focus on other vital roles.
Our contact tracers are starting to help out with our vaccination team and calling people to let them know that they're eligible for the vaccine.
But the vaccine rollout has been hectic from its start.
We really don't know exactly how much vaccine we're going to get in the state until the week before.
The federal government allocates doses to each state. Then the health department must decide which providers get the vaccine and how many doses each provider will be allotted.
When we were in phase 1A, we were allocating doses to providers based on the number of healthcare workers they had or the number of long-term care residents that they needed to vaccinate.
The state has made it through to Tier 1C, and essential workers are now able to get vaccinated. But mutant strains have thrown a curveball.
Until we have a better handle on how well contained these variant strains are, it's incumbent on all of us to maintain the same sort of precautions that have helped us keep this pandemic under better control.
As for the future, Dr. Mateo says herd immunity plays a key role in getting back to normal. He says if not enough people get vaccinated to reach 70% immunity, we could be seeing restrictions and health precautions for years to come.
It's just going to be a situation where things are never going to completely stop. Instead of boiling, it'll just be simmering. And that's what we're in for, a real long, slow simmer.
A year of darkness is ending with silver lining. For every COVID death in North Dakota, there has been at least 67 survivors. Hospital directors say their institutions have gotten stronger. Doctors say there is a newfound sense of community within their profession. And the DOH says vaccines provide the long-awaited hope that we will eventually make it out.
On December 14th, the first doses of COVID-19 vaccine were distributed in Fargo and Bismarck.
This is going to be a milestone moment where we're going to turn the tide and get over this pandemic.
Even though the vaccines were developed in record time, the wait for them felt long. And while we waited, thousands of North Dakotans lined up for COVID tests, sometimes being tested over and over again. Now that the vaccines are available, we've come a long way. But it hasn't been a trouble-free rollout. Health department leaders say it's been hectic from the start because of the massive undertaking required.
We are providing supplies to healthcare entities across the state to ensure that anyone who is symptomatic and wants a COVID-19 test can get a COVID-19 test.
One key to getting the virus under control has been the North Dakota National Guard. The pandemic has been the Guard's longest domestic response. John Salling has more on the Guard's mission over the past year.
North Dakota's Guardsmen and women give time from their lives and their jobs to serve the state. They've played a number of roles since the pandemic began a year ago. Mass testing sites like these became a common sight as kits arrived in the state.
Testing is part of the answer and part of the answer to the puzzle which we have.
We are providing supplies to healthcare entities across the state to ensure that anyone who is symptomatic and wants a COVID-19 test can get a COVID-19 test.
Colonel Brian Keller has been part of response since the first site was set up in Amadon on April 4th.
So we just kind of did it on the fly. We did it using paper and carbon paper. It was very good, but we took almost all day to do what, the number of people that we can probably do in 3 or 4 hours now.
Since then, they've adapted to using tablets and more rapid tests, helping them process thousands of people in a day when needed.
The hours that you put in was challenging, and standing, well, personally for me, standing on my feet on concrete hurts your legs and your back.
Troops helped not only on the front lines with testing, but also in the lab where guards helped process the tests.
The motto is always ready, always there. And we also pride ourselves on being very adaptive and creative and finding solutions to tough problems.
They've been used wherever the state needed extra staff, as couriers running samples or training in testing staff like the Minot Fire Department.
I've been to towns that I didn't know existed, and the towns that I knew existed that I'd never been to. I got to visit a lot of the towns in North Dakota, which is really cool. The people of North Dakota are awesome.
A year later, they're still helping across the state as the National Guard expects to reach 100,000 personnel days by the end of March.
Our first pandemic in 100 years. This was new for everybody, even those that were, career public health officials. You talk about a pandemic, you plan for a pandemic, but I think until it gets here and you see all the challenges that are presented, you don't know what's going to happen day to day.
Some of their effort is now supporting vaccinations.
The people coming through these vaccination lines are just so happy, so thankful. It's just fun to be able to visit with them.
Dorman says they average 300 guardsmen working on any given day. In 2021, they've run 142 vaccination sites and 193 testing sites as of March 9th. In Minot, I'm John Salling, reporting for your news leader.
Those hardest hit have been our seniors, especially those in long-term care facilities, who couldn't get a hug or even a visit from family members. Many died alone, a heartbreaking scenario. Long-term care facilities across the state began weighing options on how to protect residents and staff around this time last year, and the challenge was huge. Elisa Tanner visited with a Crosby couple who had to find a way to stay connected while still remaining physically separate.
Despite cold wind, snow, and rain, John Benter has stood outside the St. Luke's Care Center every morning for the last 2.5 weeks to see his wife, Marion.
When we could visit with her 3 times a day, I'd come up here and I spent a lot of time up here. And she got isolated. All I could do is wave at her through a window.
For most of their life, John and Marion were inseparable. But that changed 2 years ago.
She was a very active person right up to the day when she fell and broke her hip.
John isn't letting broken bones or COVID-19 keep them apart.
She gets awful lonesome in the evenings because I was always here up till almost 8 o'clock in the evening and helped her get ready for bed. And she called and said how lonely she was, and I said, I get lonely too.
The care center nurses help them talk on the phone every day.
But I haven't been close enough to hold her hand since this started.
It just shows the love that my parents have for each other, because we're making it work. Everybody is working and we're making it work. And we'll get through it. We'll get through it.
Love you, dear.
John says he hopes the spread of the coronavirus subsides soon so he can once again hold his wife in his arms.
Just this week, we learned that the couple has been reunited in person.
Coronavirus isn't the first pandemic to ravage the state. The 1918 influenza outbreak, also known as the Spanish flu, killed more than 1,300 North Dakotans.
It shut down schools, it shut down the churches.
When pandemics come, some are hit harder than others.
This virus does not see race, does not see ethnicity, does not see gender, does not see a border, does not see a tribal boundary or a state boundary. It's everywhere.
Native Americans are all too familiar with plagues, first brought into the state by European traders and explorers. Smallpox and chickenpox infections, to which Native people had no immunity, wiped out entire tribes in the 1800s. Here's Julie Martin.
Native American pictographs, created more than 200 years ago, shows how chickenpox devastated Native Americans.
The Mandan people, who may have had a population of 20,000 or more, were reduced to a population of about 2,000 by the time Lewis and Clark came.
Dakota Goodhouse, a Native American historian and teacher at United Tribes College,
let's go to page 331, Indian Scouts and Allies.
Say other pandemics wiped out entire villages.
The years were named, and so 1740, 1741 was smallpox year. 1781, smallpox year.
Now the coronavirus is closing in on Native Americans who struggle with healthcare access on reservations.
For example, for Standing Rock, we have 9,000 people here, yet we only have 4 medical doctors and 1 ventilator.
With a culture that values family and fellowship, diseases have the ability to travel quickly.
You have a transient population that is moving all over the place, and that's really, it just really sets up the population for that virus to gain a foothold into the communities. And
Goodhouse says it's too early to determine what impact this year's pandemic will have on Native populations.
We need to let the year pass so we can reflect on this year before we can assign a name to it.
In hopes history won't repeat itself.
Humans depend on routine. That's true for adults as well as kids. Moms and dads get up each day prepared to do their jobs, and kids head off to school. So it's easy to see why bringing that routine to a screeching halt has been so disruptive and so stressful.
When we come back, we'll take a look at the impact the pandemic has had on schools in a year when everybody from teachers to parents to students all had to learn a brand new way to learn.
None of us enjoy change. We're humans. We like it the way it was yesterday, as opposed to desiring it to be a lot different tomorrow for the most part. But this has been a lot of change that's been forced on us. It's going to be a period of discomfort. But I know that if any state is going to come through it, it's going to be North Dakota.
We all changed our daily lives, but perhaps those who were forced to change the most were students and teachers. First, schools were closed, then reopened via distance learning, before transitioning yet again to hybrid models and finally back to classes in person, distanced and masked. Haley Brown spoke with parents, teachers, and students across the state to reflect on this COVID-19 school year.
Many people I spoke with said overall they are proud of the way district administrators and teachers handled the situation. Others were disappointed in the lack of school activities students got to participate in. Students across the state are back walking in the school hallways this March, but this time last year, the halls were empty.
We're making a recommendation tonight that statewide we close the K-12 schools for 1 week. That is in 5 days.
Students face the reality that many of their school activities and extracurriculars would be canceled for the remainder of the school year.
I was shocked. At first, I was really disappointed because I missed out on my track season, which was very hard.
Educators began to miss those close relationships with their students.
We lost our personal connections of just being able to literally grab a student and give them a huge hug.
School districts adopted different models of instruction for the start of the next school year. Some utilized a hybrid learning model, a combination of in-person and online learning.
Those days, the teachers had so much on their plate, I think, that they were sort of just focused on the kids that were there. And so they were like, okay, you know, basically everybody who was here yesterday and you're schooling at home today, you know what you have to do, so go get your work done.
Teachers say juggling the two different modes of instruction wasn't easy.
We're having some students online while having some students here for hybrid who are here half the time and half not, and then having some students in front of us was difficult.
And then chances are,
as North Dakota cases started to decline and risk levels were lowered, many districts began to fully open back up, and students got to feel some form of normalcy they hadn't experienced in a long time.
He was so happy. Like, I went and picked him up and he was just talking a mile a minute when we got on the way home, because he finally got to see his friends. He saw friends that he hadn't seen in like a year.
It's unknown how long teachers, parents, and students will be impacted by COVID-19, but they say they have learned to adapt to change during these trying times. While COVID-19 brought many challenges to school districts across the state, some district leaders say the pandemic isn't all bad. Many are shifting their focus to what can they take away from this pandemic to benefit the future of education.
Travel was another part of our everyday lives that screeched to a halt, and that hit the tourism industry and especially the airports hard. In 2020, traffic at North Dakota airports plummeted, down 95% at one point. That in turn impacted the car rental agencies, the hotels and restaurants, taxis, even parking and gas station attendants. Suddenly everybody was staying home. Those who could get home, that is.
While many of the state's residents were forced into lockdown, others were desperately trying to break back into North Dakota from foreign countries. 21-year-old Samantha Clark is grateful for these videos and photos she took in Barcelona. She's also grateful to be back home in Bismarck.
Yeah.
Samantha's semester abroad was canceled last week, less than 24 hours after hearing travel from Europe to the United States would be suspended. She was on a plane back to the United States.
I did not stop shaking until I got back home. It was just really surreal.
Samantha was able to get a flight from Paris to Boston, then to Minneapolis, where her mom and twin sister met her. All three are now in a self-quarantine in their Bismarck home.
We're just kind of in our own little quarantine, trying to wash our hands, and we're not going to be going anywhere.
Samantha was tested for both influenza and COVID-19 on Monday. She's trying to wait patiently for those results, but it isn't easy.
I just feel like once I know, then I'll just feel way better about everything. And obviously I'm taking way more precautions right now. So I feel like it just will be a relief once I find out the actual result.
Until then, she's staying busy.
Should probably be writing my research paper,
finishing schoolwork, and reminiscing on the time she had abroad.
Studying abroad was still the best experience ever.
An experience Samantha will never forget.
Those businesses that were designated essential stayed open, but were required to adapt new COVID-19 guidelines. Grocery stores encouraged employees to wear face masks. Plexiglass barriers were installed at checkout stands. And who could forget this? Sales of some items skyrocketed, creating a daily struggle to keep products on shelves. People started hoarding, in particular toilet paper. It was a bit of a joke, but that didn't stop the packages from flying off the shelves. Cleaning products, wipes, and at one point it was tough to find staples like rice or hamburger. For nearly a year, most businesses had to constantly adapt in order to serve their customers. Erica Craven has more on what these establishments had to do to stay afloat.
In March of 2020, Governor Doug Burgum closed bars and restaurants and certain other businesses to limit the spread of COVID-19. By April, North Dakotans gathered at the Capitol protesting business closures and asking for the economy to be reopened.
It's too much of a hardship to be completely closed down.
Instead, as health officials advised, mandatory closures of businesses were extended. The state government then shifted focus on reopening the economy with a safe restart. Restaurants like Butterhorn modified service to fit new guidelines.
We're extremely grateful for people coming in and getting takeout.
a lot of people buying gift cards and stuff like that.
But restarting came with complications.
The advisory lifted from red to orange and orange to green back and forth, and we were still not sure. And by June, we actually had a COVID case in our restaurant. So we shut down pretty much all June.
Now, after a year, businesses are still feeling the residual effects of closures and modifications. Business owners suffered not only financially, but emotionally as well.
If you want to shut down, yes, of course you can do it. But I have 7 other employees, depends on me.
And effects of supply chain delays persist.
Bread baking, all of a sudden things that were hot new trends that we didn't anticipate 3 months ago to have the products in was a challenge.
Yet many businesses have adapted and are continuing to adapt.
Being a small business, we're really lucky we can pivot and we can do something different the next day.
At this point, it is unclear how many North Dakota businesses will be permanently affected or closed by the pandemic. Small businesses around North Dakota are also expressing gratitude to those shopping and dining locally as they navigate this new terrain.
For the moment, this feels a little bit like economic Armageddon for North Dakota.
Uncertainty, volatility, and disruption. These keywords describe the difficult year the nation's energy industry has undergone. Morgan Benth takes a look back on a hard year for one of our state's biggest industries.
Oil and gas industry leaders have had to maneuver through a tough year, which started by being put in the middle of a price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and is ending with an administration keen on ensuring clean energy trumps fossil fuels, effectively shutting down the Keystone XL pipeline and leaving producers uncertain of Dakota Access's future. A price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia was the first sign of trouble, leaving North Dakota in the middle and causing a fall in oil production. All of this hit right before the state had its first COVID-19 case. As quarantine began and travel stopped, demand for oil dropped to a historic low, having nowhere else to go, storage tanks filled with oil.
We've never been at this level at this time of the year in history.
WTI market price then dropped from an already unstable $20 a barrel to just 20 cents.
Nobody expected crude oil to go to basically a penny.
The price then shockingly dipped even lower to negative $37 a barrel. I caught up with Ron Ness with the North Dakota Petroleum Council to recount this moment.
And you start worrying about we're going to have to shut everything down, and from there it just escalated into, people having to lay people off and shut down their rigs, shut down their activities. So it was a pretty incredible shock. I would say there was shock and awe to all of us.
There's been about 13,000 unemployment claims since the beginning of the pandemic in the energy sector alone, mostly stemming from the Bakken area. One rig worker reflects on this past year's drop in production compared to 2015.
When it died out the last time, it shut down fast, but not this fast.
Industry leaders and producers are still uncertain what a full recovery will look like, but believe they won't see a hint of it until sometime next year. Under a Biden administration, the Petroleum Council says the state may be pushed to focus on renewable energy, but says North Dakota has been a leader in ensuring our energy sources are clean ones.
Just after the outbreak of COVID-19 in North Dakota, many of us may have started to look a little unkept because the personal care industry was forced to close.
But Haley Bolin found out the impacts of closing these businesses went further than just your hair being too long or your nails looking a little rough.
Governor Doug Burgum announced the closure of the personal care industry at the end of March last year, leaving many people scrambling for alternatives. Boxed hair dye, at-home manicures, you name it. However, cosmetologists themselves were facing one of the largest unknowns of all, what seemed like indefinite unemployment at the time.
Hairstylist Melissa Lundeen is putting clients on the books, and she's happy to be doing so.
Getting back to work was exactly what we wanted to be doing.
Governor Burgum closed the personal care industry starting March 28th, lasting until May 1st, 2020, leading to a full month without income for independent cosmetologists like Lundeen.
I mean, we had zero income. We couldn't do anything, and we weren't getting any of this relief that Burgum was talking about.
At the time of the closure, no one had an idea of how long the industry would be this way, including the governor.
Instead of having a bad hair day, you might have a bad hair weeks coming up.
Leading to many unknowns.
It was just sitting there and watching the news updates just like everybody else and finding out tonight at 4 o'clock, are we going to be able to reopen today?
And throughout April, Burgum remained sturdy in his closure.
We are not far enough down that track to safely lift business closures at this time. As you saw from the numbers today, the numbers continue to climb.
Cosmetologists could have faced up to a $1,000 fine if they operated during the closure. State Cosmetology Board President Maureen Warner says luckily they didn't have to fine anyone.
We had one report of one salon, and we did investigate, and she was just taking care of her family in the salon. So we just asked her that she not do that.
Then on May 1st, salons could reopen. Warner says many stylists returned in a big way.
I do have personal reports on other friend stylists who had their best year ever.
Lundeen says the closure didn't hurt her return to business.
I have not found that any clients are less likely to come in.
Stylists like Lundeen are happy their chair no longer sits empty.
Warner says to her knowledge, there haven't been any salons tied to COVID-19 outbreaks in the state.
2020 showed us how adaptable we are. Some had to rebuild their health as well as their lives, and some found new ways to worship, as we'll see up next. The vast majority of North Dakotans who tested positive for coronavirus survived, but for some, the road to recovery was long and painful. 73 Kenny Sambor is happy to be home.
Unbelievable.
His unbelievable story started in March when he traveled to Maryland for the National Curling Championships.
It started to hit me on the plane on the way home.
That was March 16th.
And I started running a temperature for 2 or 3 days and feeling really beat up, couldn't taste anything, and I just wanted to stay in bed.
After 3 days, his daughter insisted he go to the clinic. On March 23rd, he was admitted to the hospital. He spent the next 29 days in intensive care.
We've been calling every day. We miss you.
11 of them on a ventilator.
There's a very low chance you're coming off at my age with that disease.
It was touch and go there for a lot of days.
Kenny's family was not able to visit him in the hospital.
It was awful.
Which makes having him home
We will curl again.
even sweeter.
I'm one lucky guy.
His recovery isn't complete yet. Kenny is not able to walk, but he started physical therapy and will follow up with a neurologist.
So I'm essentially in a wheelchair, but I'm glad to be in a wheelchair.
He's sharing his story in hopes of saving other people's lives.
It's a horrid, horrid disease. So I just say that would be my message is be smart, be safe.
People think it's just people that were really frail that could have been killed by the flu. And it's not that, it's just not. I mean, my dad is not a typical 73-year-old. You know what I mean? He's very active.
Meantime, Kenny is determined to get back to his active lifestyle.
I will come through this. I'm going to fight. I'm going to rehab. I'll fish again. I'll hunt again. I'll golf again. I'll walk again. I may even run.
Faith life is important to many North Dakotans. So when faith leaders made the decision to close their doors in March of 2020, the reaction was immediate. Few things have a more resounding echo than an empty house of worship.
A bit of shock, I think. It's unprecedented. We haven't done this before.
That was the initial reaction of a lot of people to the news that COVID-19 would close the doors to their churches. And for weeks, the pews were empty.
I had never experienced that, and like many of us, we had never experienced that. So it was hard not to go.
There were some who mourned, some who were relieved, and there were a lot of questions, especially for pastors who had to keep up with the constant COVID changes.
I was tired a lot because it's like you're reinventing everything all the time. You don't just have a plan B, you have a plan B, C, D, E, F for everything, and it's just exhausting.
First Sunday under the new suspension of masses rule, as you can see here, it's quite bare.
At first, the worry about what could happen, how the virus was spread, who was vulnerable, and how deadly it would be was hypothetical.
So it was kind of out there in the periphery of our minds, in mine anyway, in my perception.
Then it became all too real. Among the first in North Dakota to fall ill were pastors.
And yesterday posted this message to Facebook.
It's been quite a week. This thing's for real.
Monsignor Patrick Schumacher was just weeks into his new assignment as pastor at Corpus Christi Church in Bismarck when he made the announcement on Facebook that he had contracted COVID.
I felt awful because we were at a difficult time here, already restricted with directives, and then I'm the one that gets sick. And then people had adverse reactions, which I completely understand.
Scary as it was to hear about those first cases, it wasn't long before everybody knew somebody who was sick. By then, recommendations from the state and the CDC were well established, and churches opened their doors again, but to a new and ever-changing normal. Small gatherings, social distancing, masks, hand sanitizing, and services online for those watching from home.
We decided right from the beginning to follow the CDC and the state guidelines on that, and so we were down to 25% of capacity, and we had a lot of members that didn't want to come, of course. This is the body of Christ given for you.
As the months progressed, people have adapted. For some, perhaps a little too well.
Started off, dressing up in our finest, kneeling during the proper postures while we were watching it at home. And then, with time, the kids get a little more distracted. It takes more energy to keep them together, and then eventually, it's no longer the Sunday best, and it's jeans, and then finally it's on the couch with a cup of coffee. And
that's one of the reasons he was glad when Bishop David Kagan announced the return of the Sunday obligation for Catholics, despite people's lingering fears.
Coming from the faith side of it, death is not to paralyze us.
He says the timing was a surprise to some, and not everybody was happy about it, but it may have provided a needed push.
And then there was a group that I've heard from that said, yeah, I needed that nudge.
As we approach spring and Easter, many restrictions have been removed, with accommodations such as mask-only services or designated seating for the vulnerable. But social gatherings are still largely canceled.
And we haven't had any potlucks, which for a Lutheran, that's important.
I've missed sharing the peace, for one thing, because we're quite a huggy, shake hand type congregation.
They say being part of a faith family means a great deal.
The word church means gathering. Church is not a building, this is a house of worship. The church is actually when the people are here, when the people are gathered. Our Father, who art in heaven.
Praying together for an end to the pandemic.
Faith leaders have been working with the state health department to separate misinformation from fact. People who are vulnerable or ill are still encouraged to stay home. And of course, some things may not change. Some churches have indicated they will continue online services. And in the end, it might give us all a greater appreciation for our religious freedom and ability to gather with those of like beliefs. As 2020 drew to a close, people looked with renewed hope to vaccines.
Up next, we'll look at the impact that has had as our lives slowly return to normal.
Residents in long-term care facilities were among the first to be vaccinated, and those vaccines have opened the doors again. Daniel Burbank reports from the Sheridan Memorial Home in McCluskey.
This hug was 1 year in the making. Because of the lockdown, Melva Schindler, or Grandma Mel, wasn't able to have visitors for a while or get a hug from her granddaughter until now.
I mean, that's really hard when you come and visit and you can't hold their hand. You can't give them a hug, you can't give them a kiss. And that's been hard the last year, so it was just really special.
Melva stays busy when family isn't around.
This is a good place for fun and
We get serious once in a while.
This week's fun activity
Are we ready?
is an important milestone,
Happy birthday to you.
celebrating Melva's 99th birthday.
Need more.
And you better mean it.
Cake is a nice surprise for residents. Emma Boehm likes to eat her dessert first.
Because if you don't like the food, you have the dessert.
Boehm was born in the Ukraine and walked across 9 countries before coming to North Dakota in 1951. After escaping communism, she says there's always a way of staying optimistic.
Live for the future.
When they aren't celebrating birthdays, Betty Nathan enjoys the bird atrium or crocheting.
This keeps me out of trouble.
Nathan's room is lined with her prizes from bingo games. She told us back in October she likes to give them away at Christmas time. Recently, the CDC released new guidelines for gatherings of fully vaccinated people, and Missy Axt, the director of nursing, is confident we're heading in the right direction.
The last year has given us a lot of challenges, but for us, being in a very rural area and being a very small facility has given us some benefits.
Axt, her staff, and residents are more than 80% fully vaccinated. They're still a long way from taking the masks off, but they have each other, and they're reminded about family each time they walk through the hallway and pass the tree of life.
All visitors are still required to schedule a visit ahead and follow CDC guidelines.
Some people we may not have known before have now become the rock stars of the pandemic era. Governor Doug Burgum has held 82 press conferences since the pandemic began. Lindsay Solberg-Herbel has been at every one of them.
Communication is a big part of volleyball. But for Amira Ironboulder, communication looks a little different.
You know what I mean?
The 6th grade volleyball player needs help interpreting her coach's instructions and her teammates' feedback. That's why Lindsay Solberg-Herbel is here.
Does that make sense?
Want to include people, then we have to provide communication access.
As a certified interpreter for the North Dakota School for the Deaf, Lindsay finds herself at all kinds of different events.
We could go to the hospital, we can go to the emergency room, we can go to court, we can go to this meeting, we can go to, a volleyball practice.
On March 15th, 2020,
As we face this health emergency,
Lindsay found herself somewhere
Solberg-Herbel
she'd never been before. Governor Doug Burgum's March 15th press conference was the first time an interpreter had been included at a press conference.
I just thought, oh boy, what did I just get myself into?
During uncertain times when things were changing quickly,
the virus doesn't discriminate.
One thing was constant.
I have not missed any since I got that call.
Lindsay, the fastest signer in the West.
The first few weeks, every day was, what am I going to wear? I know that sounds kind of lame, but I thought, all of a sudden, I know that everybody's going to be watching me.
Her wardrobe choices were somewhat limited.
We always wear something solid because it's easier to see your hands on a solid surface than if I would be wearing stripes.
Lindsay's work at those press conferences propelled her to celebrity status, something nearly a year later she still can't quite understand.
It's very strange.
Lindsay is recognized nearly everywhere she goes.
I'm just doing my job.
She's got a box filled with cards and letters from fans, newspaper clippings, and stories of being recognized.
This is after the press conferences that had been going on for a while, and one of the other mothers at daycare was picking up her daughter, and she said, Abby will see the governor on TV, and Abby will look at him and say, there's the man that stands next to Max's mom.
Lindsay works hard to make sure she's signing correctly. That means preparing before the press conferences and critiquing her work after.
I am not perfect. I will never be perfect. But I really try to make sure that I'm doing things accurately, doing things in the right way, to make sure that the information is correct.
Whether that information is about the pandemic,
Thank you all for tuning in today,
or about the next volleyball drill, Lindsay's hands are always moving.
and always striving for inclusion.
It's important to make sure everybody is included. And we also need to see that everybody is different, and we might communicate in different ways, we might move in different ways, but we're all in this state together. We all need to work together.
We've shared multiple stories of people who've gone the extra mile.
These feel-good stories made us realize despite all the unknown, there is still more good in the world than we might realize. Erin Paulson's daily routine has changed a little in recent months. Several times a day, she wipes down her musical instruments. But Mrs. Paulson is happy to do that because it means she can be back in her music classroom at Bismarck's Miller Elementary, teaching her students face-to-face.
It is so wonderful to be back in a classroom together.
Here we go.
When school shut down last spring because of coronavirus concerns, Mrs. Paulson got creative.
Pattern 1.
She started holding weekly virtual jam sessions.
Right now. Hey, let's rock right now.
Mrs. Paulson shared the videos on the school's PTO Facebook page as a way to connect with Miller families. Mrs. Paulson wasn't the only one keeping the music alive during those first few months. Pat Phillips wrote a song called Academic Epidemic. He wanted to capture the experience of transitioning Bismarck's public schools to online classes.
Communicate, collaborate, create, that's essential.
Good morning, Moses Stars.
Dorothy Moses Secretary Kristen Meidinger
Exercise, that's right. Does body good.
Knew it was important to add a little normal back into her students' daily routine.
Hello, I've missed you guys.
She recorded the daily announcements.
We all love you and we miss you.
In some pretty creative videos.
All right, everybody, I'm upside down.
I pledge allegiance.
Bowman teacher Amanda Rafferty was craving her regular routine too. So she and her young children started leading the Pledge of Allegiance live on Facebook.
United States of America.
It's not the same, but it's better than nothing.
In Beach, high school juniors figured out a way to hold a socially distanced prom.
Hello, Sam Cougar.
Solheim Elementary gym teacher Mike Porter missed his students so much.
I'm going to be walking the South Bay area now.
He hit the streets.
Look who I ran into.
And walked through his students' neighborhoods.
I'm getting my miles in, heading south on Washington. Until I see you, take care.
Families were so touched by his extra effort, they planned a surprise parade past his house.
Thank you!
We appreciate everything that they're doing for our kids.
Wachter Middle School Secretary Carrie Lear also put in some extra miles to show her appreciation. She pounded about 70 of these signs into the ground outside teachers' homes. The Student Council at Wachter Middle School put together a heartfelt video to show their appreciation. Their video attracted national attention.
At Wachter Middle School,
a portion of it aired on Dr. Oz. Parents at one school gathered in prayer.
Position your heart.
In the parking lot at Solheim Elementary,
in Jesus' name,
they prayed for teachers, administrators, students, and for an end to COVID. While the pandemic isn't over, neither is the positive energy created over the past year. Through all the uncertainty and unknowns, one thing has stood out time after time. Most people are good at heart.
Since the start of the pandemic, we've had to share news that was sometimes frightening, sometimes just plain bad. But there have been good things too that help us remember that people are basically good. If it does nothing else, the pandemic has made us appreciate the value of a hug and an unmasked smile.
The hope is that we've all learned more about kindness and how to care for one another, and that the virus that changed everything changed us all for the better. Stay well. I'm Jody Kurzman.
And I'm Monica Hannon. Thanks for joining us.